Everyone's heard of the Fallschirmjäger, the German paratroopers who dropped into Crete, who held the line at Monte Cassino, who fought in the frozen killing fields of the Eastern Front. They were elite, trained harder, equipped differently, and expected to do the impossible with whatever they had on hand. And part of that equipment, part of what made them distinct from every other soldier on the battlefield, was their sidearm. Not the Luger, not the Walther P-38. Something different, something stranger, something that looked almost too industrial to be elegant, and yet somehow became one of the most desired pistols of the entire Second World War on both sides of the conflict. The FG-42 gets most of the glory when people talk about German paratrooper weapons. The Sate G-44 gets the drama, but the pistol, the one specific sidearm developed for and issued to German Fallschirmjäger, that one gets overlooked. And that is a mistake, because the story of that weapon is not a simple story of engineering triumph or military genius. It is a story of desperation, of compromise, of battlefield reality, forcing the hand of bureaucrats who thought they knew better. It is a story of a weapon that was called unreliable by the people who issued it, demanded by the soldiers who carried it, and hunted down by the enemies who faced it. If you want to understand what it was like to be a German paratrooper in the Second World War, you need to understand their pistol. And before we go any further, if this kind of deep dive into forgotten weapons history is what you came here for, hit that subscribe button right now, because this is what we do, and we are just getting started. To understand why German paratroopers ended up with a unique sidearm at all, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the late 1930s, when the concept of the Fallschirmjäger was still being invented in real time. The German military was building something that had never really existed before at scale. A force of soldiers who would leap from aircraft, fall through the sky, and then fight their way through enemy territory before any conventional ground force could link up with them. This was not a theoretical exercise. The Germans were serious about it. And one of the first problems they ran into, one of the practical challenges that nobody had fully thought through, was the question of how a paratrooper actually carries his weapons during a jump. On the ground, a soldier can carry a rifle, a submachine gun, a pistol, extra magazines, grenades, and a pack. The weight is uncomfortable, but manageable. In the air, during a parachute jump, things are very different. The equipment catches air, it shifts, it can throw off the fall, it can become a genuine danger. And there was another problem specific to German parachute design. The German parachute used in the early war years, the RZ-16, and later the RZ-20, had a single attachment point at the top of the harness, rather than the two shoulder attachment points used by American and British designs. This meant that when a German paratrooper exited the aircraft and the chute deployed, his body was forced into a near horizontal position during descent. He came down facing the ground at roughly a 45-degree angle, which meant a brutal landing. But it also meant that anything he was carrying on his body had to be carefully managed. Rifles and submachine guns were typically dropped separately in weapons containers that the paratroopers had to locate after landing, and for those agonizing seconds or minutes between landing and reaching their weapons container, they needed something compact, something they could wear during the jump, something that would work immediately. That something was a pistol, but not just any pistol. The standard German service pistol at the start of the war was the Luger P-08. Beautiful piece of engineering, iconic silhouette, beloved by collectors and historians for a very good reason. But the Luger had problems that made it less than ideal for frontline military use in the chaos of the Second World War. It was expensive to manufacture. It was sensitive to dirt and debris. The toggle lock mechanism, which was genuinely innovative when Georg Luger designed it in 1898, was also genuinely finicky when conditions got rough. Sand in the receiver, mud in the toggle, cold temperatures affecting the tolerances. The Luger could become unreliable in exactly the kinds of conditions where a combat soldier needed maximum reliability. The Wehrmacht had already started transitioning to the Walther P-38, which was a more modern, more robust, and cheaper to produce replacement. But for the Fallschirmjäger, there was a specific desire. A sidearm that was powerful enough to be genuinely useful in a fight, compact enough to be carried on the body during a jump, and capable of being used with one hand if necessary, because the other hand might be dealing with parachute lines or a rough landing. Various options were looked at. But the weapon that would end up becoming synonymous with the German paratrooper, the one that would end up being the most sought-after pistol on the entire Western Front, was something that came from a very unexpected direction. It came from a manufacturer that nobody would have predicted, and it came loaded with controversy from the very first day it was proposed. The weapon in question is the Dries Pistol 08, more commonly referred to by collectors and historians under various designations, but the one that truly defines the paratrooper sidearm story in World War II is the FP-45. No, wait. Let us be absolutely precise here, because this is where so many accounts get tangled. The pistol we are talking about, the one that the German Fallschirmjäger became specifically associated with, the one that was developed with their particular operational needs in mind, and the one that generated the most controversy during the war, is the Walther P-38 in one context, but far more compellingly, and far more dramatically, the weapon that defines this specific story is something called the Volkspistole in one iteration, and in the earlier, more crucial paratrooper-specific context, the weapon that was specifically trialed, debated, and ultimately issued to Fallschirmjäger units in limited numbers, with all the drama and argument that came with it, was a modified and rechambered variant of existing designs adapted for paratrooper use. But here is where the story takes its most interesting turn. The weapon that most precisely fits the description of the unreliable German Fallschirmjäger pistol that became one of the most sought-after weapons on both sides is the Sauer 38H. And the reasons it became that story are more fascinating than almost anything in small arms history of the Second World War. The J.P. Sauer and Sohn Company had been making weapons since 1751. That is not a typo. They were a company with nearly 2 centuries of experience when the Second World War began, and they had produced some of the most elegant and precisely engineered pistols in Europe. The Sauer 38H, introduced in 1938, was in many ways their masterpiece for that era. It was a compact, double-action semi-automatic pistol, chambered in 7.65mm Browning, which is also known as the 2032 ACP. And it had a feature that was genuinely ahead of its time: a decocking lever. Not a safety in the traditional sense, but a mechanism that allowed the shooter to safely lower the hammer on a loaded chamber without risk of accidental discharge. This was engineering sophistication that not many pistols of that era could match. The Sauer 38H was issued to German police, to Luftwaffe personnel, to certain military units, and yes, to elements of the Fallschirmjäger. And in many hands it performed beautifully. But the story becomes complicated, as it always does with weapons in wartime, because battlefield conditions are not the same as factory test conditions. The criticisms leveled at the Sauer 38H and at certain other pistols issued to Fallschirmjäger units were not entirely without basis, but they were also not entirely fair. The 7.65mm cartridge, while accurate and manageable in terms of recoil, was considered by many combat soldiers to be underpowered for a serious fight. When you are a paratrooper who has just landed in the middle of enemy territory, possibly injured from the landing, possibly separated from your rifle, and waiting to reach your weapons container, the last thing you want to be thinking is whether your pistol round has enough terminal effect to stop a threat quickly. Soldiers talked. They compared notes. They grumbled. And the word unreliable started to circulate. Not always because the mechanical function of the weapon failed, though that did happen under extreme conditions, but because the perceived stopping power was considered insufficient. Reliability in combat is not purely a mechanical question. It is also a question of confidence. A soldier who does not trust his weapon is a soldier who hesitates. And in the context of airborne operations in the Second World War, hesitation could be fatal. But here is the twist. The very pistols that German paratroopers complained about, the compact, well-engineered sidearms that seemed underpowered or finicky compared to heavier service pistols, were the exact same weapons that Allied soldiers desperately wanted to get their hands on. And the reasons for that tell you everything about the nature of war, and the nature of human desire for things that seem just out of reach. American and British soldiers who encountered German paratroopers in combat, whether in Crete, in Sicily, in Normandy, or in the grinding battles through Western Europe, quickly developed a reputation for certain battlefield practices. One of those practices was the collection of German weapons as souvenirs and trophies. Lugers were the most famous targets of this souvenir hunting. Every American GI who came back from Europe seemed to have a Luger story, but the Sauer 38H, and the other pistols carried by Fallschirmjäger specifically, developed their own following. And it was not just sentiment or trophy hunting. There were practical reasons why Allied soldiers wanted these German pistols, and the story of why is a window into the specific brutal logic of ground combat in the Second World War. An infantry soldier in 1944 carried his primary weapon, his ammunition, his kit, his rations, and everything else he needed to survive. His pistol, if he had one at all, was a backup. something for situations where his primary weapon was fouled, empty, or simply wrong for the moment. For officers, the pistol was often the only sidearm they carried. For NCOs and specialized soldiers, it was a tool of last resort. The American M1911 in .45 ACP was powerful, enormously powerful by pistol standards. It would stop a man cold with a solid hit. But it was also large, heavy, and the .45 ACP ammunition was specific to American weapons. A German compact pistol, by contrast, offered something different. It was smaller, lighter, and in many cases felt more refined in the hand than the big, blocky American service pistol. It felt like something valuable, something precise. It felt like it had been made by people who genuinely cared about the craft of making a pistol, rather than people who were trying to produce the maximum number of units for the minimum cost. And in the chaos and filth and exhaustion of a combat zone, that sense of craftsmanship meant something to the soldiers who picked these weapons up. There was also a more practical consideration. A German pistol taken from a dead or captured paratrooper came with magazines already loaded, sometimes with spare magazines in the pouches of the man who had carried it. The ammunition was immediately available in a way that purpose-captured souvenirs often were not. A soldier who took a German pistol and kept it as a backup had a functioning secondary weapon that he could use if his primary was down. This happened. This was documented. This was not just a theory or a romantic notion. Allied soldiers used captured German paratrooper pistols in combat, and the Sauer 38H and its contemporaries were among the most prized of these captures, precisely because they were so well made, so compact, and so functional in the hand. Now, let us talk about the operational context in which these pistols were used, because the story of the Fallschirmjäger pistol cannot be separated from the story of the Fallschirmjäger themselves, and that story is one of the most dramatic and ultimately tragic arcs of the entire Second World War. The German paratroopers began the war as what amounted to a wonder weapon, a strategic asset that could be deployed with devastating effect to seize objectives that conventional forces could not reach quickly enough. Their early operations were brilliant, terrifying, and stunningly effective. In May 1940, a small group of German paratroopers captured the Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael, one of the most powerful defensive fortifications in Europe, in a matter of hours. This was not a fortress that was supposed to fall quickly. It was designed to withstand prolonged assault from conventional forces. But paratroopers, landing on top of the fortress itself, using hollow charge explosives and brutally aggressive tactics, destroyed its defensive capability before the garrison fully understood what was happening. The world, including the Allies who watched in horrified fascination, did not know what to make of it. Then came Crete in May 1941, Operation Mercury, the largest airborne operation in history up to that point. Over 22,000 German paratroopers dropped onto the island of Crete in a sustained assault that lasted nearly 2 weeks. And this is where the story of the Fallschirmjäger pistol becomes most vivid and most visceral, because the Battle of Crete was fought at exactly the kind of close range where a sidearm mattered. German paratroopers jumping onto Crete faced something they had not encountered before at this scale: immediate, ferocious resistance from the moment their feet hit the ground. New Zealand, Australian, British, and Greek defenders were waiting. They had been warned by intelligence. They were ready. And the German paratroopers, who came down in their characteristic nearly horizontal position, struggling with parachute lines, landing hard on rough ground, scrambling to find their weapons containers, were extraordinarily vulnerable in those first seconds and minutes. The casualty rate was catastrophic. In some drop zones, more than half of the paratroopers were dead or wounded before they could organize into fighting units. The weapons containers, which held the rifles and submachine guns that the paratroopers needed, were scattered across contested ground. Defenders were shooting the men as they hung in their harnesses. The scene was horrific, even by the standards of the Second World War. In those terrible moments between landing and reaching a weapons container, the pistol was everything. It was the only weapon these men had. And the performance of that pistol, its mechanical reliability, its practical accuracy at close range, its ease of use by a man who might be disoriented, injured, and fighting for his life. All of that was not theoretical. It was being tested in real time, in blood and chaos, on the olive groves and rocky hillsides of a Mediterranean island. The Fallschirmjäger who survived Crete, who managed to organize, find their weapons, and eventually overcome the defenders through sheer aggression and the weight of numbers, came away with strong opinions about their sidearms. And those opinions were not always favorable. The pistols they had been issued were sometimes found wanting. Not always because they jammed or misfired, but because the cartridge did not always produce the immediate incapacitating effect that a man fighting for his life needed. Not always because the mechanism failed, but because the magazines were sometimes too small, the capacity too limited for a sustained firefight. And sometimes, yes, because the mechanism did fail, because a pistol that had been in a weapon's pouch during a parachute jump, that had absorbed the impact of a hard landing, that had dirt or grit from rough Cretan terrain worked into the action, did not always function the way it had in the factory. The Germans won Crete, but the cost was so devastating that Hitler, watching the casualty reports come in, made a decision that effectively ended the German airborne assault program. Never again would German paratroopers be used in a large-scale airborne assault. The Fallschirmjäger, for the rest of the war, would fight primarily as elite ground infantry, not as paratroopers. They would still carry their distinctive weapons, still wear their distinctive uniforms, still maintain their ferocious reputation as fighters, but they would not jump. The era of the German airborne assault, which had seemed to promise a revolution in warfare, was over after Crete, and the weapons they had carried into that battle, including the pistols that had been specifically considered and debated for their use, became part of a legacy that was frozen in that moment of terrible glory. This is the context in which the debate about the Fallschirmjäger pistol needs to be understood. The weapon was not failing in some routine peacetime evaluation. It was being tested in the most brutal possible way, and the men who carried it were forming judgments that were colored by the trauma and urgency of combat. The criticisms of the pistol were real, but they were also shaped by the extreme nature of what these men were experiencing. No pistol in the world would have satisfied every complaint made by men who were fighting for their lives in one of the most desperate airborne operations in military history. And yet, even as the Fallschirmjäger complaints about their sidearms circulated through the military hierarchy, something else was happening simultaneously. The pistols they were carrying were becoming objects of intense desire in the hands of their enemies. The contradiction at the heart of this story is one of the most human things about it. The weapon that the Germans called problematic was the weapon that the Allies called desirable. The same object, looked at from different sides of the same war, seen in completely different lights. Let us talk about why the engineering of these weapons was genuinely impressive, because the dismissal of them as unreliable does not survive close examination. The Sauer 38H, to take the most specific example, was built to tolerances that were extraordinary for a mass-produced military sidearm of the era. The double-action trigger mechanism, which allowed the shooter to fire from a fully decocked position without manually cocking the hammer, was smoother and more refined than almost anything its Allied counterparts were carrying. The decocking lever, which allowed a soldier to safely lower the hammer on a loaded chamber, was a genuine safety innovation. Modern pistols use variants of this concept as a standard feature. In the early 1940s, it was ahead of its time. The overall fit and finish of the Sauer 38H, even in the later war production versions when material quality was beginning to decline, was notably better than what you would find on equivalent Allied production pistols of the period. The bluing was finer, the action was smoother, the tolerances were tighter. These were not propaganda claims. They were measurable engineering facts that collectors and gunsmiths have confirmed repeatedly in the decades since the war. The issue with the 7.65mm cartridge as a combat round is a separate question from the quality of the pistol itself, and conflating the two has contributed to the reputation of these weapons being unreliable, when the more accurate complaint would be that the cartridge was considered underpowered by combat infantry standards. This is not the same thing. A perfectly functioning pistol firing a cartridge that soldiers feel is inadequate will develop a reputation for unreliability because the operational outcome they want, the immediate incapacitation of a threat, is not always achieved. The mechanical function of the weapon is not what is failing. The cartridge is not delivering the terminal performance that the soldier expects, but to a man in a firefight, those distinctions do not feel meaningful. If you shoot someone and they keep coming, your weapon failed you. Whether the mechanism jammed or the bullet was not powerful enough, the outcome from your perspective is the same. This understanding of how battlefield reputation works is crucial to unpacking the contradictions in the Fallschirmjäger pistol story. German paratroopers were typically aggressive fighters who had internalized an expectation of decisive, immediate results from their weapons. When the pistol did not deliver that decisive result, the pistol got the blame. Allied soldiers, coming at the same weapons from a different angle, evaluated them differently. They were not typically using captured German pistols as their primary weapon in an airborne assault. They were using them as backup weapons, as souvenirs with functional value, as tools for specific close-quarters situations. In that context, the smooth action, the compact size, the refined engineering, and the functional reliability of the mechanism under normal conditions made these pistols genuinely excellent. The cartridge power debate was less relevant because these Allied soldiers were not relying on the pistol to stop an enemy attack by itself. They were using it as a supplement. The result was a strange kind of market dynamic in the middle of a war. German paratroopers, trained to want the most powerful possible tool for the job, were dissatisfied with what they had been given. Allied soldiers, encountering those same tools as war prizes, were delighted by what they found. The pistols moved from German dead to Allied pockets, from German holsters to American and British kit bags, and they traveled back across the Atlantic and the Channel when the men who found them went home, becoming the most tangible kind of connection to a war that had taken years of their lives. The demand for these weapons among American GIs was so intense that a significant secondary economy developed around captured German small arms. Soldiers traded them, sold them to each other, mailed them home despite regulations against it, and in some cases went to significant trouble to acquire them when the opportunity presented itself. The Luger commanded the highest prices in this informal market, but the Sauer 38H and the other Fallschirmjäger associated pistols were not far behind. Their compact size made them easier to conceal and ship. Their quality made them satisfying objects to own, and their association with the Fallschirmjäger, the elite German paratroopers who had a ferocious combat reputation, gave them a particular kind of martial cachet that translated directly into desirability. There is a story that circulated among American veterans of the Normandy campaign, though, like many such stories, it exists in multiple variations and cannot be pinned to a single verified source, about a Fallschirmjäger officer captured in the hedgerow country of Normandy, who was relieved of a very finely made German pistol by an American officer. The German, apparently in no mood for his prized sidearm to become a souvenir, argued about it. The American, outranking the situation if not the German prisoner, kept the pistol. This kind of interaction, this small personal drama of ownership and desire, played out over a weapon that both men understood to be something worth arguing about, happened thousands of times in different forms across the European theater of operations. It is not remarkable as an individual incident. What is remarkable is how many times it happened, and what it says about the status that certain German weapons had acquired in the minds of both sides. Now let us look at the specific operational history of how Fallschirmjäger pistols were carried, because the way a weapon is used in the field tells you things about it that no factory test can reveal. German paratroopers in the early war period, when they were still being used in genuine airborne assault roles, had a specific set of requirements for their sidearms. The weapon had to fit in a holster that could be worn on the body during a jump without creating a dangerous snag point. It had to be accessible immediately upon landing, before the paratrooper had time to locate his weapons container. It had to be operable with one hand if necessary, because the other hand might be managing equipment or bracing against a rough landing. And it had to be reliable enough to function immediately in whatever condition the jump had put it in, whether that was dusty, damp, jarred by impact, or subjected to temperature extremes between altitude and ground level. The Sauer 38H, by most accounts, met most of these requirements reasonably well. The double-action trigger meant that the weapon could be drawn and fired in a single continuous motion without manually cocking the hammer. The decocking lever meant that a paratrooper could carry the weapon safely loaded without an external safety lever that might catch on equipment. The compact size made it easy to holster and access. These were genuine advantages for the specific operational context of airborne assault, and they were not accidental. They reflected the fact that the weapon had been designed with a certain kind of user in mind, a user who needed fast, safe, accessible firepower without a lot of manual preparation steps. But as the war evolved and German paratroopers transitioned from airborne assault troops to elite ground infantry, the context changed. Fighting in the rubble of Monte Cassino, in the forests of Normandy, in the urban devastation of Italian cities, the paratrooper needed something different from what he had needed over Crete. He was no longer jumping from an aircraft and fighting his way to a weapons container. He was dug in, He was defending positions. He was conducting close-quarters urban combat in situations where a pistol might be his primary weapon for extended periods rather than a brief emergency backup. In that context, the criticisms of the Fallschirmjäger pistol became more pointed. The magazine capacity of the Sauer 38H, 8 rounds in 7.65 millimeters, was not generous by any standard. The cartridge power, which had been merely a subject of complaint in the Crete context, became a more serious operational concern when the pistol was being used for sustained fighting, and the mechanical reliability, which had been adequate for short-duration emergency use, began to show more stress under the conditions of prolonged ground combat. This evolution in operational context is one of the reasons why the official German military assessment of Fallschirmjäger pistols became increasingly negative as the war progressed, even as Allied demand for these same weapons reached its peak. The Germans were evaluating the weapons against a changed set of requirements. The Allies were encountering them when they were still relatively new, relatively well-maintained, and being evaluated against completely different benchmarks. The Monte Cassino campaign, which lasted from January to May of 1944, provides one of the most vivid illustrations of both the strengths and limitations of Fallschirmjäger sidearms in the context they were actually being used by this point in the war. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, among the most decorated and battle-hardened German units of the entire war, held the monastery and the surrounding heights against repeated Allied assaults for months. The fighting was as brutal as anything in the Second World War. Room to room, boulder to boulder, hand to hand at times. The conditions were terrible beyond description. Rain, mud, cold, constant artillery, limited supply, and an enemy that was equally determined and increasingly better armed. In this environment, the German paratroopers carried whatever they could get their hands on. Their primary weapons were rifles, submachine guns, and machine guns. Their pistols were last resort weapons, and in that role the Fallschirmjäger pistol served its purpose. Men who had their primary weapon destroyed, or who were in situations where a long arm was simply not practical, drew their pistols and used them. And the Allied soldiers who took these pistols from German casualties or prisoners at Cassino were taking weapons that had been through some of the hardest combat of the entire war. They were taking a piece of the most ferocious defensive stand that the German military made in Italy. And they knew it. That knowledge added value to the object. Not monetary value, though that was real, but historical and personal value. The weight of what had happened in those hills transferred to the objects that had been carried there. The question of what made the Fallschirmjäger pistol specifically sought after, as opposed to other German weapons, comes down to a combination of factors that are partly practical and partly psychological. On the practical side, the compact size of most Fallschirmjäger-associated pistols made them easy to carry and conceal. They were personal weapons, worn on the body, which meant they had a more intimate association with the individual who had carried them than a rifle or machine gun that might be shared or position assigned. A pistol carried by a Fallschirmjäger officer had been in that man's holster, at his hip, for months or years. It was as personal as a watch or a ring, and in the strange psychology of battlefield trophy collection, that personal association was precisely what made it valuable. On the psychological side, the Fallschirmjäger had a reputation that elevated everything associated with them. These were not ordinary German soldiers. They were the men who had taken Eben Emael, the men who had fought for Crete, the men who held Cassino. Their reputation as fighters of extraordinary quality and ferocity meant that anything they had owned or carried was marked by that reputation. An Allied soldier who came away from an encounter with a Fallschirmjäger unit, who had survived something that not everyone survived, and who had a German paratrooper pistol to show for it, had something to show beyond just a war souvenir. He had proof of the encounter. He had a physical object that said something about what he had done and what he had come through. The pistol was not just a pistol, it was a story. This is not a minor point. The desire for battlefield trophies is as old as warfare itself, and it has always been partly about the story the object tells, and partly about the object itself. The Fallschirmjäger pistol told a particularly powerful story because the men who had carried it had a particularly powerful reputation, and that reputation, built in the olive groves of Crete and the rubble of Cassino and the hedgerows of Normandy, transferred to the object and made it something worth having long after the war was over. The post-war collector market for Fallschirmjäger-associated weapons, and for German World War II pistols in general, developed rapidly and has never really subsided. Sauer 38H pistols that can be traced to Fallschirmjäger or Luftwaffe provenance commands command significant premiums over standard examples. The documentation that links a specific weapon to a specific unit or theater adds value that is almost impossible to quantify, because it transforms the object from a manufactured artifact into a piece of history. Collectors understand this in a way that non-collectors sometimes find puzzling, but it is not really puzzling at all. It is the same impulse that makes people preserve letters and photographs from historical events. The object is a connection to a moment that matters, and its scarcity and specificity are what give it meaning. Now, let us talk about the specific mechanical details of these weapons, because they deserve examination on their own terms, beyond the drama of their operational history. The Sauer 38H action is a locked breech, short recoil design with some clever engineering choices that reflect the sophistication of its designers. The barrel is relatively short, around 3.3 inches, which is appropriate for a compact carry pistol, but does limit velocity somewhat with the 7.65mm cartridge. The magazine holds 8 rounds, which was a standard capacity for compact pistols of the era. The slide is compact and smooth, with minimal external snag points, which was a deliberate design choice for a weapon intended to be drawn quickly from a holster. The double-action trigger pull is smooth and consistent, which is difficult to achieve mechanically and reflects the care that went into the action design. The single-action pull, for follow-up shots after the first double-action trigger stroke, is crisp and much lighter, which aids accuracy in aimed fire. The decocking lever, which is the most distinctive and innovative feature of the Sauer 38H design, operates by catching the hammer as the trigger releases it and lowering it gently to a safe position against the firing pin block. This is mechanically more sophisticated than a simple manual safety because it allows the weapon to be carried safely with a round in the chamber and the hammer down, ready to fire with a standard double-action trigger pull, without any external lever that needs to be disengaged. In the context of a paratrooper reaching for his pistol immediately after a rough landing, this means one fewer step between drawing the weapon and firing it. That one step might seem trivial in calm conditions. In the first seconds after landing in a contested drop zone, it is not trivial at all. The finish on the Sauer 38H varies across production periods in ways that are themselves historically informative. Early production examples have a deep, lustrous blue finish that reflects the high standard of pre-war and early wartime German manufacturing. As the war progressed and material and labor constraints tightened, the finish became progressively simpler. Later production examples have a more matte finish, simplified markings, and sometimes cruder machining on parts that are not critical to function. But even the late-war Sauer 38H retains a level of mechanical quality that many equivalent Allied production pistols could not match. The Germans were making compromises by 1944 and 1945, but they were making them more grudgingly and less radically than some would suggest. The grips on the Sauer 38H are checkered black plastic, which became standard as the war eliminated access to the natural materials that had been used earlier. They feel solid in the hand and provide adequate purchase, though some users find them slightly narrow compared to more modern designs. The overall ergonomics of the pistol are generally considered to be good for its era, with the grip angle and overall balance feeling natural in the hand without the awkward dimensions that characterize some contemporary designs. One of the things that makes the Sauer 38H particularly interesting to shoot today, for those who have access to functional examples, is how well the double-action mechanism communicates with the shooter. The trigger is progressive in a way that is easy to manage, building pressure smoothly rather than stacking suddenly as some double-action designs do. For a shooter who has experience with modern double-action pistols, the Sauer 38H feels surprisingly familiar. For someone handling it with fresh eyes, it feels immediately intuitive, in a way that speaks to the quality of the design. The engineers who built this weapon knew what they were doing, and their knowledge shows in every interaction with the mechanism. The 7.65mm Browning cartridge, which is the other half of the equation and the source of so much of the operational complaint, is worth understanding in its own right. Designed by John Browning and introduced in 1900, the cartridge was developed for a completely different purpose than military combat. Browning created it for the FN Model 1900, a semi-automatic pistol intended primarily for civilian self-defense. The cartridge is mild, generating relatively low pressure and delivering a round-nosed 71-grain bullet at velocities typically around 950 feet per second, which produces relatively modest terminal effects by any measure. It is not a combat cartridge in the sense that the 9mm Parabellum or the .45 ACP are combat cartridges. It was designed to be manageable and accurate in a small, easily carried pistol, and it succeeds admirably at that goal. As a cartridge for stopping enemy soldiers in close combat, it is less impressive. And this fundamental mismatch between the cartridge's design purpose and its combat application is the root of most of the operational complaints that German paratroopers had about their pistols. They were not wrong to complain, but the complaint should be directed at the selection of cartridge for military use, not at the mechanism of the pistol. There is also the broader context of German pistol caliber choices during the Second World War to consider. The Wehrmacht's standard service pistols were chambered in 9mm Parabellum, which is a genuinely effective combat cartridge with substantially better terminal performance than the 7.65mm. The fact that Fallschirmjäger were often issued weapons in 7.65mm rather than 9mm reflects a combination of supply logistics, procurement decisions, and the specific nature of the compact pistol market in Germany during that period. The compact pistols that were small enough to wear on the body during a parachute jump were mostly chambered in 7.65mm because that was the cartridge that the compact pistol market had settled on. Moving to 9mm in a comparably compact package was technically possible, but was not standardized in production at the scale that would have been needed to equip all Fallschirmjäger units. This is another dimension of the unreliable label that is not quite fair. The pistol was unreliable in the sense that the decision-making chain that chose to issue 7.65mm weapons to combat paratroopers rather than developing or procuring suitable 9mm compact alternatives was unreliable. The institution made a poor choice, and the soldiers paid for it. But the pistol itself, evaluated on its own mechanical terms, was not unreliable. It was doing what it was designed to do. It was being asked to do something it was not designed for. The parallel with many other examples in military history is obvious. Equipment that performs well in its intended role gets criticized when it is forced into a role it was never designed for. The Sauer 38H was an excellent compact carry pistol for police and security personnel who needed a manageable, safe, easily carried weapon for situations where the probability of actually having to fire it was relatively low, and the range at which it would need to perform was typically very short. In that role, it was superb. As the primary emergency weapon of a paratrooper in a contested drop zone, fighting for his life against enemy soldiers who had their own weapons and were determined to use them, it was compromised by its cartridge and its magazine capacity in ways that had nothing to do with its mechanical quality. The Allied soldiers who coveted these weapons were not making a mistake in finding them desirable. They were evaluating them correctly for the role they would actually play in Allied hands, which was supplementary backup weapon and trophy of value, not primary combat arm for a paratrooper in a desperate fight. The Germans were also evaluating them correctly for the role they needed them to play, which was exactly that desperate primary weapon. Two correct evaluations, arriving at opposite conclusions because the intended use cases were so different. This kind of divergent evaluation is one of the most interesting aspects of military small arms history. Weapons develop reputations that are shaped by the specific demands and expectations of the people who use them, and those demands and expectations vary enormously depending on who you are, what you are doing, and what you have to compare to. The Fallschirmjäger pistol story is almost a case study in how context shapes perception, and how the same object can be simultaneously a disappointment and a prize depending on which side of the encounter you are on. After the war, the Sauer Company survived the division of Germany and eventually became part of J.P. Sauer und Sohn GmbH, which continues to produce firearms to this day under the Sig Sauer brand in partnership with Swiss manufacturer Sig. The lineage from the World War II Sauer 38H to the modern Sig Sauer products sold globally to military, law enforcement, and civilian customers is direct and real, even if the company's history has some complicated chapters in between. The engineering philosophy that made the Sauer 38H notable, a smooth, reliable, double-action mechanism with safety features that were ahead of their time, is reflected in the design priorities of Sig Sauer products today. The double-action decocker concept that the Sauer 38H pioneered became a standard feature of high-quality service pistols for decades afterward. The SIG P226, used by American Special Forces and countless police agencies around the world, operates on principles that trace back to the same engineering tradition that produced the Sauer 38H. In that sense, the legacy of the Fallschirmjäger pistol is not just historical, it is functional. It is present in the design of weapons being carried by soldiers and police officers right now. The Fallschirmjäger themselves, the men who carried these pistols through the most brutal ground